X-class flares. Now, I was ready to move on to other topics, but at 9:25 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time last evening on May 14th, 2013, is when I'm writing this, we had the fourth X-class solar flare in 2 days. So the whole sunspot region has now turned the corner from the other side of the sun as it rotates, and it's now facing Earth. Scientists predict a moderate chance of having even more such flares on May 15th, 16th, and 17th. So all this may not be over yet. I should mention that scientists have long speculated that at some point the sun will emit a solar flare so large that it fries all of the electronics on Earth, sending us instantly back into the 15th century. They say it will happen, but it may be 10,000 years from now, or it might be tomorrow. No one knows. Regardless, my interest has always been in the inner, psychological, and the creative aspects of these intense solar phenomena. And I've already written most of what you need to know in order to negotiate these last several days. And there are 2 free ebooks and videos on the topic if you just go to dharmagrooves.com. So I'm just going to continue here with this theme. So please bear with me or do other things, because this is a very rare and a strong time. So letting our attention rest on the solar influx, not to mention the current eclipses, is warranted. In other words, I'm back to trying to point out to readers how to detect change within the self when that vantage point itself is what's changing. It's the Heisenberg principle incarnate. The self, our self, is tireless and elastic in extreme. It's clever. It bobs and weaves and bends over backward to avoid the tides of change that roll in, to preserve the status quo. It's very, very conservative. It's willing to do almost anything rather than to give up ground or admit a mistake. Now, we should all know that. Any one of us has ever been in an argument. So when it comes to matters of ourself, as mentioned, most of us are the perfect conservative. The self does not like to be embarrassed, upset, or disturbed. But then that self that we're pointing at here is not the real us. In fact, it's only something that we ourselves created, or at the very least have allowed to happen to us. And as I've pointed out in these blogs endlessly, we identify with the self at our peril. Our self is kind of that secret garden of our likes and dislikes that we tend or feed. The desires of all of our attachments. It's like the plant in the movie Little Shop of Horrors, whose refrain is always, "Feed me." Well, solar flare activity is not kind to directionality, to any kind of linear thinking, straight line thinking. And it tends to kind of level out our little sand castles so that we have to start over. And it does this very simply by just pulling the rug of enthusiasm or spirit, or call it direction, right out from under us, leaving us wondering why we thought whatever we are doing would work in the first place. For me, it takes time for the dust to settle after an influx of solar change, after a big solar flare, or a series of them like we're having now. It takes time until some form of directionality, linear directionality, can reestablish itself and send me off on, yet another life mission. I certainly fall for the, quote, man on a mission scenario every time. I've got to be going somewhere, or I feel kind of naked and empty. And these four giant flares have managed to level out most of my directions right now. And with heavy solar change, I always have to eat a lot, if only to kind of weigh me down, like a deep sea diver uses weights to reach the ocean floor. I need to feel grounded. And at these times of intense solar activity, I do a lot of just sitting still. Sitting still and searching or waiting in my mind for directions, signs to appear. And I mean real still. Solar change kind of truncates direction. It leaves me with no personal compass. And it always takes time for the self to reestablish connections, much less accumulate something that amounts to a life direction. In the meantime, I wait. Now, years ago in the beginning, I used to be a little terrified whenever I would lose my sense of direction in life. Of where I'm going, under a solar storm like we're having now, for instance. I would look around and I would do what I could to reestablish my last known direction and then try to take it up again. Yet just as often I would draw a blank. So over time I've come to appreciate having the self I'm stuck on kind of vacated, including whatever train of thought I was on, leaving me just silent, wordless, thoughtless, somewhere alone in my universe. And these very large vacations or gaps, these very large gaps that come with solar flares, and I'm not talking about just moments or hours, but I'm talking about hours and days, when I have little to no clue where I'm going. I've learned not to attempt to force a direction, but to just let go as much as possible and allow myself in its direction to kind of fall into place in as natural a way as I can. There's no question that the self will eventually reconfigure, and it will do it as quickly as it's able. And once established, it will be as airtight as it was before, but perhaps in a somewhat altered configuration, going in a different direction. Desperately forcing, panicking, and forcing ourselves to come back together quickly does not benefit us. The more we can let go and allow the self to organically come back together, the more comfortable will our grip on life be going forward. So just exactly what's to be done? Most of all, we each have to eventually get to know the self. And that's where the old phrase, familiarity breeds contempt, is kind of useful. Well, contempt doesn't help, but a couple of wry smiles certainly should be allowed. As we get over worshiping ourselves and constantly being distracted and entertained by ourselves, and as we begin to develop some sense of humor about all of this, the self becomes less dense or opaque and gradually becomes even transparent. Very slowly we begin to see through it, like through a window pane. And what is beyond the self, for each of us, is simply the awareness, the luminosity, the awareness of the true nature of our mind, which isn't the self. It's like the old Zen drawings of the ox herder. After recognizing the self for what it is, just our favorite pastime, the self is still with us. Nothing has changed, but something has changed. And that's our own view and eventually our entire vantage point. As I keep harping, this that I'm describing is the transmigration of consciousness. As we tune out our preoccupation with ourself and then begin to find that beyond that is something much greater and more portable too, meaning this awareness I'm talking about is what we will eventually take with us when we die. Certainly not our self. The self, like our body, is made up of our attachment, and it's just, it's deconstructed, or I guess discorporates. After we recognize or begin to recognize what the self really is about, of course the self is still there, but it now works for us and not we for it. We begin to treat our own self like we would treat the self of anyone else, with as much kindness and politeness as we can manage. And as I like to say, in my own case, I turned myself out to pasture many years ago, like an old cow, and I let it graze. I no longer battle with it as much. Instead, I've learned to almost be friendly, but its hold on my attention is gradually being loosened, and I am free to begin to be aware of awareness itself, and to identify with that instead of myself. It's a simple transfer of vantage point, and this is the key point. It's a transfer of consciousness. It's the transmigration that sometimes people write about. It's what would happen if you died and were reborn, but you can do it before you die. I know, that's abstract. The self eventually becomes the tool that it is and always has been, but it's no longer a real obstacle. In time, we learn to look through or past and behind the self to the overall awareness that embraces the self, which turns out to be who we really are anyway. And these solar flare times are perfect for getting insights into all of this. To see the show, we have to open our eyes, which we tend at times like these of intense solar change to keep closed.